After we announced my pregnancy, my sister-in-law's plan to humiliate me at my husband's birthday party completely backfired. And let's just say it landed her in jail and possibly a divorce. So, I'm Emily, 29F, and I've been married to James, 31M, for 7 years now. Our marriage is great, don't get me wrong, but there's one huge problem. His sister, Lindsay. She's like a black cloud that just hangs over everything, bringing all the negative vibes into our life. When I first met her, I genuinely liked her. But after getting to know her, I quickly realized she's toxic, manipulative, and just overall a negative person. I've worked hard to keep things civil between us over the years, but it's been tough. A bit of backstory. James dated Lindsay's best friend when he was 17, but they broke up because James felt pressured to be with her thanks to Lindsay. Then when James was 23 and single again, Lindsay tried to set him up with one of her other friends, saying he should be with her. James wasn't interested, and when he didn't listen to her, she went crying to their parents, demanding he marry someone she was comfortable with. Their parents didn't really take her seriously, and while James and I were falling in love, his parents were pretty supportive of us. But Lindsay? Oh, she wasn't having it. She treated me coldly from day one. She'd always bring up James's exes when I was around, as if to remind him about how great they were and suggest he get back in touch with them. James thought it was weird and asked her to stop, but when I wasn't around, Lindsay would start mocking me, saying I was jealous and that James could do better. The worst part? She'd deliberately invite one of James's exes to family dinners, saying they'd bumped into each other that day. Like, come on. She doesn't follow me on Instagram, but somehow she's always the first to see my stories. If any guy dares to comment on my pictures, she runs to James and complains that I'm posting inappropriate images. James and I just laugh it off, but it still stings a little. She would tell anyone who would listen that I was jealous, and that James shouldn't be with someone like me. It was the same old nonsense, but it started to get worse. Lindsay would deliberately invite one of James's exes over whenever his parents called us for dinner. She'd claim it was just a coincidence, that they bumped into each other and had to invite them along. But it was obvious she was doing it to get under my skin. She doesn't follow me on Instagram, but somehow she's always the first to see my stories. I'd post a picture and within seconds I'd get a notification that Lindsay had seen it. If any guy dared to comment on my photos, she'd rush to James and complain that I was sharing indecent images of myself. James and I would chuckle about it, but deep down it was starting to get to me. It was just so childish. The worst part was when she tried to convince James to break up with me when we agreed to live together. She told him I was defective as a woman, and that he could do so much better than me. It hurt more than I care to admit, especially since I had been nothing but polite and friendly to her all along. But then things took a darker turn. As soon as James and I got engaged, everything changed. We shared the news with the family and everyone was ecstatic. Everyone except Lindsay. He was quiet the whole time, barely reacting. Then just as we were all celebrating, she suddenly jumped up from her chair, ran out of the room and left the gathering without a word. James got a call from her later that night. She was sobbing, absolutely hysterical, saying how she couldn't believe we hadn't told her first. She claimed she was the closest to James and deserved to be the first one to know about our engagement. It was all about her as usual. Later on, she sent me this message that was so strange and borderline threatening. She told me that I needed to respect her relationship with her brother because she had always been the only woman in his life. I remember reading it and just shuddering. I left her message on scene. I knew it would piss her off, but honestly I didn't even care anymore. I couldn't deal with her manipulative crap. From that point on, every time Lindsay saw me she would completely ignore me. She started inserting herself into every part of the wedding planning, even when it was clear she wasn't invited. When I went wedding dress shopping she showed up uninvited, and when I had my bridal shower she had to make her presence known. Both James and my future mother-in-law had called her out on this several times, but Lindsay didn't care. Her criticism of everything I did during the wedding planning was next level. She would openly mock my choices, express how much she hated everything and tear apart the smallest details. It was honestly exhausting trying to keep the peace, but I was at my breaking point. So, after all the passive-aggressive comments, manipulative behavior and constant negativity, I finally had enough. It felt like everything had been building up to this point and I couldn't hold it in any longer. It all came to a head when Lindsay overheard me talking about the centerpiece with my future mother-in-law. I was trying to figure out what worked best for the wedding, and Lindsay, of course, couldn't just let it go. She immediately started mocking my choice, saying it had no class, and that this was exactly why she thought James should marry someone better than me. And that was it. That was my breaking point. I turned to her, flat out told her she was no longer invited to our wedding, and I couldn't stand her constant criticism anymore. The look on her face was priceless. She was stunned, completely taken aback, like she had never expected me to actually stand up to her. What really hit me though was that even my mother-in-law stepped in to back me up. It felt like everyone could see Lindsay for what she was. Someone who thrived on drama and negativity. Later that night, Lindsay called James, crying and saying how embarrassed she was. She told him I had humiliated her in front of the family and that he should control me since I would be his wife. James, being the supportive husband he is, told her that he backed my decision and that she wouldn't be attending the wedding if she didn't shape up. Of course, she texted me an apology afterward. One of those, "I'm sorry if you were offended" types of apologies. I read it, saw the typical manipulative tone and left it on read. I was too tired from wedding prep to deal with her anymore. But then, she showed up at the wedding. And let me tell you, she looked like she was at a completely different event. While the rest of us followed the soft pastel pink and white theme, Lindsay showed up in a black floor-length gown complete with a veil. It was obvious she was there to make a statement. She spent the entire reception making passive-aggressive comments, telling anyone who would listen how devastated she was to lose her brother to another woman. James had had enough and confronted her about the outfit, saying she was free to wear whatever she wanted, but I wasn't being too controlling by picking the wedding theme. She tried to act like the victim, crying to everyone, and that's when my mother-in-law and father-in-law stepped in and asked her to leave. Honestly, it was embarrassing, but at the same time I felt a sense of relief. I no longer had to pretend to tolerate her toxic behavior. After that day, I made it clear to James that Lindsay would not be around our son, Nate. She tried to argue, but thankfully my in-laws were on my side. They completely understood why I wanted her away from him. Now Lindsay had been through a miscarriage a couple of years ago with her ex, Jamie, and I felt for her. It was a heartbreaking time and I empathized with her pain. So, when James and I decided to give her a chance to bond with Nate, I wanted to believe she had changed. She was actually decent at first, loving and kind to Nate, but it didn't take long for her to slip back into her old ways. The passive-aggressive comments, the need for attention, the control over everything, it all came back. I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt, but now I know better. She's never going to change. She constantly goes on about how the whole world is out to get her, how everything always goes wrong for her, and how it's never her fault. She blames ex-friends, old bosses, or anyone else she can think of for ruining her life. It's always someone else's fault, never hers. Over time, I've realized she's never wrong in her thinking, and she plays the victim card like it's her job. She's always trying to get people on her side, but if you ever dare challenge her or point out her flaws, she'll turn it around and make it your fault for misunderstanding her. The entitlement? It's next level. She chose to get married this year and invited everyone except you. Given that our relationship seemed to have improved, James was surprised when we found out we weren't invited. When we confronted her, she started explaining how she wouldn't let me come, because I would cause a disturbance at her wedding. When we asked her about it, having never done anything to her, I decided to call her. I phoned and asked her why she thought that. She began to tell me how she had deliberately dressed in all black for our wedding, so now she was worried I might do the same, and that's why she wanted me to stay off-site. I couldn't believe it. The audacity. I immediately informed my husband James about how manipulative she was being. Outraged, after discussing with his parents, James decided to let Lindsay know that neither he nor his parents would be attending her wedding, nor would they pay for it. This news turned Lindsay to tears, and she began blaming me for starting this disaster. Her husband Jamie tried to intervene and told her she had no right to point fingers at me, especially when she freely admitted her own error. But Lindsay, of course, tried to explain her behavior away. She told me I should just get over it because our wedding was long ago. I was so tired of her, but she reached out to me later, apologizing and asking for forgiveness as if nothing had happened. And even though I hate to say it, Lindsay can be very charming and convincing when she wants something. I decided to let go of the past, thinking maybe this time she'd finally changed. Her wedding to Jamie went perfectly. We all showed up, had fun, and I thought things were finally going to be okay. But not even 6 months later, Lindsay showed up at our door, grumbling about her marriage failing. For a few days, James and I let her stay with us, where she spent endless hours venting about her husband. They were clearly struggling to conceive, and Lindsay was obviously blaming Jamie for everything. When I went to speak to her about it, she insisted that it was entirely her husband's responsibility. I couldn't take it anymore. Her inability to accept any responsibility for herself was exhausting. Lindsay would always focus too much on our lives, trying to create problems that didn't even exist. For instance, every morning before heading to work, I go to the gym. When I'm running late, I occasionally grab my work clothes so I can finish my workout, take a quick bath, and change into my business wear. Lindsay had been observing this for a while and kept asking me so many questions about it, like why I was bathing or why I even needed to visit the gym at all. I didn't think much of it at first and would tell her that I liked keeping in shape and didn't want to show up to the office all sweaty. But there was something about the way she'd ask something off. She'd nod her head, but it was the way she'd lick her lips while listening that made me feel uneasy. Then one day while we were having lunch she started talking about a friend of hers who had just gotten a divorce. Apparently the friend left her husband and took half of his assets after discovering his affair. That's when it got really weird. Lindsay suddenly stopped mid-sentence and looked at James, asking if we had signed a prenup before we got married. The whole table went silent. I could feel the tension rising and we just stared at her. James didn't know how to respond and I was at a loss for words too. We stopped eating. It was like the air had been sucked out of the room. She looked at James as if I wasn't even there. My husband James is not one to mince words, so he looked her straight in the eye and said, "We don't need a prenup. We both do well for ourselves and there's no reason to think otherwise." Lindsay scoffed and then she went off, saying how we could easily be blindsided, and how cheats are everywhere these days. Honestly, I was absolutely offended. My heart was pounding and I couldn't hold it back anymore. I demanded that she clarify what exactly she meant by that. And then it got worse. She casually mentioned that I was obviously meeting someone, since I was always carrying a change of clothes. As if it was any of her business. She even said that as James's sister, it was her duty to warn him about me. I was shocked beyond belief and I couldn't believe my ears. Who did she think she was to make such wild assumptions about my private life? Before I could speak up, James's parents arrived, and they immediately stepped in, telling Lindsay she shouldn't be interfering in our private matters. But Lindsay didn't stop. She didn't care at all. She insisted she was only trying to protect her brother, and then as if to push it even further she joked about whether our son Luke was actually James's child because he didn't really look like him. I was stunned. That was the last straw. The words she had just spoken felt like a slap in the face. I couldn't believe she would go so far to try and tear our family apart. James was furious but I felt like I couldn't even speak. The whole situation was so wrong and I had no idea how much more I could take from her. Lindsay wasn't stopping. She kept pushing as if the words couldn't escape her mouth fast enough, and soon enough she began questioning whether Luke really looked like James. "He's different, don't you think?" she said, her eyes shifting. Between them, her words coded in the kind of insinuation that could cut through the air. It wasn't just the comparison, it was the suggestion, the little jab that planted doubt, and it struck a chord deep in the pit of my stomach. I swear I could see the anger creeping into James's face, turning his expression into something unfamiliar. I'd never seen him like this before. His jaw tightened, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if he were holding on to the last bit of control. And then without a second thought he met Lindsay's gaze head-on. "Lindsay, you're not a mother," he said, his voice steady but laced with a quiet fury. "You don't even deserve to be one. If you had a child they'd be better off in paradise than with someone like you." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp, like the first drop of rain before a storm. Lindsay stood there, her lips parting in shock, trying to digest what had just been said to her. There was a brief moment of silence, as if the world had paused, giving her no choice but to face the truth. But there was no going back now. My in-laws, James's parents, just sat there silent. They didn't know what to do. James wasn't backing down. He continued, calling her a shameless person, someone who was trying to ruin everything, all because her life had nothing to offer. She was just a loser, plain and simple. James went on to say that she had nothing better to do all day while her husband worked non-stop. He told her that she was simply projecting her own misery onto us, and she needed to focus on fixing her own marriage instead of interfering with ours. At that point, Lindsay started crying, expecting us to feel sorry for her. She turned to Jamie, sitting right next to her, looking for comfort, but he didn't even look at her. He just stayed quiet. James has never been the type to break down emotionally, but seeing Lindsay push him to this point was something else. After a few moments, Lindsay stood up, stormed off, and ran into the bathroom. My husband was boiling over with anger, but I just held his hand. I knew he was frustrated, but this was something he had to confront. James's mother and father, thank God, stepped in and tried to calm him down, knowing exactly how exhausting Lindsay's behavior was. I was honestly relieved James stood up for me publicly the way he did. After all the years of Lindsay's disrespect, it felt good to have my husband on my side. Eventually, James apologized to Jamie for the way he had reacted, but he completely ignored Lindsay. Once he had cooled off, we just shut Lindsay out of everything. I wasn't willing to deal with her manipulative behavior anymore, and neither was James. A year passed and we didn't hear from her. Our lives were peaceful, and it felt like we had finally rid ourselves of the constant toxicity she had brought into our family. James's parents agreed that Lindsay had gone too far this time, and they could see how their usually calm son had been pushed to the edge. It felt like a weight had been lifted from all of us. 2 months ago I discovered I was pregnant. Honestly, it was unexpected, especially given the fact that we hadn't really been trying, but the thought of welcoming another family member into our lives was a huge blessing for James and me. We decided to share the news during James's birthday celebration. We had been waiting for the perfect moment, and his parents, Harry and his mom, were throwing a big party in their garden. Our close friends and relatives were invited. Of course, Lindsay had to show up. I could tell she'd heard the news through the grapevine, and I wasn't exactly thrilled. As soon as we saw her, James and I exchanged a glance. I knew it was going to be an awkward moment. Lindsay came up to James, gave him a hug and said, "I missed you so much. I'm really sorry about our last conversation." Then she turned to me, took my hand and said, "I've been seeing a therapist these past few months. I realize now how wrong I was to treat you the way I did. I'm sorry." I wasn't sure I bought all of it, but for the sake of peace and wanting to keep the mood light in front of everyone, I nodded. I didn't want to stir up anything at that moment, especially when this was supposed to be about James. My in-laws, seeing the situation, checked in with us, offering to ask Lindsay to leave if we felt uncomfortable. But James insisted on handling it with calm, and we decided not to make a scene. Oddly enough, Lindsay was laughing and socializing with everyone as if nothing had happened. She was talking about how great therapy had been for her, and I thought maybe she really is trying to change. I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. But the whole thing felt off. Even though Lindsay was acting unusually upbeat, completely not her usual nature, I decided to just go with the flow. James gave a beautiful toast, saying how lucky he felt to have me by his side for another year. He was so sincere and sweet, and it made me feel like I was back in those early days when we first started dating. I couldn't help but blush. Felt like the perfect moment. But then when it came time to cut the cake, things got strange again. As I was about to take my first bite, my eyes caught something on my plate. I froze. I have a shrimp allergy, and just the sight of it made my stomach churn. My throat tightened, and that familiar wave of panic washed over me. Shrimp and egg allergies are no joke for me. They've always been a risk I carry like an invisible weight. I could feel the tightness in my chest, creeping up like it always does before a full-blown reaction. My heart started to race, and I tried to steady my breath, but my mind was already spiraling. I started to think about my food allergies and intolerances, those things I have to navigate every day, as if my body is constantly at war with the simplest of foods. Thought to myself, what is a food allergy really? It's like your body is betrayed by something so harmless to everyone else. It's an immune system response, a fight that's happening within my body, turning something as innocent as shrimp or eggs into a potential enemy. The food allergy symptoms can range from a slight discomfort to a suffocating struggle for air, and sometimes I just wish it was all easier. I didn't want to make a scene, especially since it was James's birthday, but I couldn't ignore how risky the situation felt. It was like a food challenge I didn't want to deal with, but I had to for my own health. James noticed my hesitation immediately. He stepped in and offered to get me something else, which I was grateful for. I didn't want to make a scene, but the thought of my allergies and the weird vibe with Lindsay were enough to set me on edge. Despite everything that had happened, Lindsay seemed oblivious to the tension. She was laughing and mingling with everyone, trying to act like nothing had happened between us. But I couldn't ignore how everything seemed to revolve around her discomfort and how easily she could change the mood. I couldn't help but value the fact that my husband and I were still intensely in love. That moment, with the warmth in his eyes, felt like a small victory, as if everything we had been through had led to this. Then Harry and I made the decision to let everyone in on some fantastic news. We exchanged a grin before we said, "We're having a baby." There was a moment of stunned silence. Everyone paused to consider what we'd just said. And then the room erupted in delight. My mother rushed up to hug me, tears filling her eyes as she cried out, "I knew it! I knew it!" Phil, too, gave us a salute, and tears streamed down his face as he embraced us. Everyone was eager to know if we had picked baby names, and it was clear how genuinely thrilled they all were for us. But there was one exception: Lindsay. She was the sore thumb that stood out in the crowd. Her mood shifted in an instant. She seemed stunned, but instead of joining the celebration, she simply turned away, a hint of irritation in her expression. I assumed maybe she just needed some time to process the news, but a small part of me felt uneasy. I worried that she might ruin yet another moment for us. Another party, another chance for things to go wrong because of her. I tried to focus on the joy around me, but I was distracted by friends and family approaching to congratulate us. I got up to assist my in-laws with carrying some food to the table, but Rick and my parents immediately begged me to sit back down. "You should stay seated," they insisted. "Don't even move." I nodded and smiled, grateful for their concern. But then Lindsay approached me with a beaming smile. I was calmly waiting for my husband to bring me a plate of food, thinking maybe I'd finally get a moment to relax. She said, "I want to offer you dinner myself to make up for everything." She handed me a dish, and as she passed it to me, she even mentioned how much she wanted to make up for all the time she had been nasty to me in the past. I didn't know whether to be suspicious or gracious, so I nodded politely, accepting the dish. She turned to walk away and I was ready to start eating. But then my stomach dropped as I looked at the plate in front of me. Shrimp. Right there on my plate. It hit me like a ton of bricks. I have a shrimp allergy. The sight of it made my heart race, my throat tightening instantly. How could she? How could she do this to me? This wasn't an accident. She knew about my allergies. She had to. I looked at the dish and felt the panic rising. Egg. I could see it there too. The combination of shrimp and EGG was like a ticking time bomb. My mind raced through the questions. What is food allergy and how bad could this be? For me, it was never just about a little discomfort. It could trigger serious food allergy symptoms. The familiar signs were creeping in, and all I could think about was food allergies and intolerances and how those things could take over my body without warning. I had a moment to breathe, but not much longer. I knew I had to react, but I didn't want to cause a scene at James's birthday party. I'd already been through so many food challenges in the past. Why did this have to happen now? I know I am quite allergic to shrimp, which is why I was so surprised when Lindsay brought me a dish with it on it. I was disappointed but tried not to make a scene. I shook my head and got up to get my own lunch. At that moment, Jamie approached me to wish me well on my pregnancy. After a brief conversation, he asked me why I hadn't been eating. I hesitated, but Jamie reassured me, telling me not to worry, and quickly removed the dish from my hands after I pointed out that Lindsay had served me shrimp, probably by error since he enjoyed eating shrimp. Jamie kindly offered to take the dish, saying he could eat it and I could get a fresh plate for myself. I nodded and smiled, feeling relieved. But just as I turned away to move on, something went terribly wrong. Jamie suddenly began to vomit and retch. It all happened so quickly. 5 minutes later, barely even 5, everyone at the table stopped eating, eyes wide, watching him stagger to get out of his seat. James and Lindsay rushed towards him in concern. Jamie gestured at his plate and then at his throat. Our eyes widened in shock as we realized something had gone horribly wrong. Jamie collapsed. The entire room gasped in unison and the tension was palpable. Kayla immediately rushed over to check on him and her eyes grew wide with horror. She turned to stare at me, her expression a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Did you give him your plate?" she asked, her voice shaking. I nodded in shock. Someone had already called for an ambulance, and Jamie was rushed to the hospital amidst the chaos. Through all of this, Kayla was sobbing uncontrollably, her gaze fixed on me with growing anger. We were told later that Jamie had been poisoned. I could barely breathe when I heard that. The plate I had accepted from Lindsay had been the same one Jamie had eaten. The thought struck me with a sickening realization. That food, that seemingly innocent dish, may have poisoned both me and my baby. This fact was still unknown to Harry, his parents, or mine, since no one had known what was in the food that caused Jamie to faint like that. In the midst of the turmoil, the police were called to collect evidence from the dish. Jamie is still in recovery at the hospital as I write this. Kayla stayed with him overnight, constantly asking questions. Our relatives are calling, wanting to know what happened to Jamie and who might have poisoned him. And through all of this, one question keeps echoing in my mind. Could this really have been intentional? Was this some twisted attempt to hurt me or my family? I've been fielding calls all day and the weight of what happened is still sinking in. My mother-in-law and father-in-law are staying over at our house because they're terrified to go back to theirs. None of us know exactly what went wrong, but everything was going so smoothly until that moment when everything shifted. I had to come clean and tell everyone that the plate I received originally belonged to me, and how Lindsay had been the one to hand it to me. The thought alone fills me with a cold, heavy dread. If this turns into a full-blown investigation, I'll have no choice but to tell the cops the truth. But what really scares me is what Lindsay might do next. I feel utterly defeated by everything that's transpired. I want to keep my distance from her, but I can't escape the constant fear that she has no limits when it comes to trying to harm me. I can't bring my kids near her, not with what she's capable of. The whole thing feels like a nightmare, handing Jamie my plate only to think that perhaps unknowingly I contaminated my own meal as well. Update 1. I've been overwhelmed by the sheer volume of responses to this post. Thousands of comments in just a few hours. I never imagined such an outpouring of support and advice. I typed this earlier with shaky hands, and even now I haven't been able to sleep. I can't stop thinking about Jamie and how everything could have gone so differently. I should have just tossed the plate away when I had the chance. Why did I let him take it? I keep tearing up thinking about his future and how close I came to causing something much worse for him, for us. James has been hovering near me, concerned about me, but he doesn't know the whole truth about his sister. He thinks I'm just upset about Jamie's reaction, but I'm terrified of what Lindsay is capable of. I agree with some of the comments, suggesting I should sit down and explain everything calmly, but I'm not sure anyone will believe me. Thankfully, James's parents have security cameras around the house. Since the party took place in their backyard, I'm confident the footage can prove that Lindsay was the one who handed me that plate. I plan to speak with everyone tonight and I'll keep you all updated. Update 2. So, we finally sat down together tonight. I can't say it's been easy, but I'm feeling a bit better now, having some support. Pal and PL are still staying over and we all had dinner together. I knew I had to tell them something important, and to be honest, my stomach was in knots. The whole situation was weighing on me and every word felt like it would add more stress. But they needed to know. I took a deep breath and started telling them everything. I explained how Lindsay handed me the plate with shrimp on it and how Jamie accidentally ate it, which led to his reaction. Their faces were a mix of shock and disbelief. Honestly, I don't think they were ready for this, just like I wasn't. They exchanged glances and I could tell they were processing what I was saying. But you could see the concern growing in their eyes. They had no idea how to react, but I could see they were starting to understand the magnitude of it all. MIL and PIL looked at each other like they were hoping someone would say something to make it all make sense, but no one spoke. They knew this wasn't something that could just be brushed off. James's face shifted from confusion to pure rage as I continued, expressing my concern about Lindsay's intentions and her past attempts to hurt me. The thought of the possible consequences for me and our unborn child made me hesitate, but I had to say it. Seeing my hesitation, Emil, my mother-in-law, immediately suggested we review the security footage. Given the seriousness of the situation, she didn't waste a second. Pil, my father-in-law, nodded in agreement, though he looked clearly disturbed. James stayed silent, his mind processing what I had just revealed. We pulled up the footage from the security cameras and the truth was undeniable. The video clearly showed Lindsay handing me the plate of raw shrimp, and moments later we saw what happened to Luke. The weight of the evidence left no room for doubt. As the reality sank in, emotions surged through me. James was now fully aware of his sister's malicious intent, and the anger he fought to suppress was obvious. Pal and PL were horrified by what they saw. They were equally stunned by the lengths Lindsay had gone to cause chaos in our lives. We sat there in silence, trying to wrap our heads around why she would do something so vile. This wasn't just a petty argument, it was a very serious issue. After some discussion, MIL and PAL decided to forward everything to the police. Luke, the one who suffered the most, would have to press charges against Lindsay. So PL and James planned to visit him once he recovered. I can't stop thinking about the moment I handed Luke the poisoned plate. I keep replaying it over and over in my head. I feel sick every time I consider how I contributed to this. Luke's reaction is the one thing I can't predict, and it's been eating me alive. I haven't been able to eat properly or sleep. I'm just too anxious, waiting to see how he'll react. I'll update you on anything noteworthy as soon as I know more. Update 3. Alright, here's the update finally. I know it's been a month since my last post, but things have been a lot. First things first, Lindsay was detained after MAL and PL handed over the security footage to the police. Lindsay confessed immediately, no hesitation, no excuses. He started crying, but she didn't deny a single thing. The truth was laid bare and she couldn't argue her way out of it. Luke was as shocked as the rest of us when James sat down with him to discuss what had happened. James told him that no matter what he chose to do, he would always be part of our family. Despite everything, Luke is still family, and James made it clear that he was there for him, no matter the fallout. James advised Beale, Emily's brother-in-law, to press charges against Lindsay, and I couldn't agree more. After Bil recovered, not only did he choose to press charges, but he also sought a divorce. The whole situation was emotionally draining, especially with Lindsay calling and begging them to forgive her. Kayla called Mil and Peel, trying to control them by saying they should help her for the sake of their granddaughter. She was practically begging for a second chance, trying to guilt-trip them. But Pia wasn't buying it. He told her she needed to own her actions and stop getting bailed out every time. They were done babying her. Paul was heartbroken over what was happening to Lindsay, but she knew that her actions couldn't be easily forgiven. The police uncovered evidence that Lindsay tampered with the food meant to harm me, but it backfired, causing harm to her own husband. She's now facing multiple charges, including reckless endangerment, damaging property, and food tampering. Lindsay is still blaming me for it all, claiming it was my fault. But thankfully BL is determined to prosecute, and her court hearing will begin soon. I don't think she can get away this time. As for me, my son and I are doing okay. Thank you for asking. As for the questions about Lindsay and her actions, my son has no idea what's going on. James and I have discussed it and decided that we'll sit down and tell him the truth. I know it's going to be a tough conversation, but it's one we need to have, especially to protect him from confusion later on. Also, per my doctor's advice, I'm continuing to have ultrasounds every 2 weeks to monitor my pregnancy. We've decided to keep the baby's gender a surprise, so we won't be finding that out ahead of time. After everything with Lindsay, my parents have become more protective of me. They've been urging me to seek treatment to manage the stress, and I'm considering it since this whole situation has been overwhelming. Since my family is deeply concerned about my mental well-being during the pregnancy, they've encouraged me to get proper treatment. I agree with them, especially since while I'm managing okay, I've developed a deep-rooted fear due to what Kayla did to my meals. I now avoid eating any outside food or anything I haven't personally prepared. It's a bit of an irrational phobia, I know, but I'm hoping my husband will help me work through it. He understands what happened and he's been incredibly supportive throughout everything. Update 4. It's been 8 months since I last checked in. Kayla is currently in prison after being found guilty of all the allegations. I didn't attend her court hearings, but Mil and PL would occasionally fill me in on the details. According to them, Kayla admitted in court that she had been jealous of me for years. She confessed that when James and I started dating, she had always dreamed of one of her close friends marrying him, not me. So when she realized I was the one he chose, she began harassing me. The real turning point came when we shared our pregnancy news at James's birthday party. Kayla had been planning to announce her pregnancy too, but after her miscarriage she wanted the moment to be hers alone. She felt like we stole her opportunity to shine. Her jealousy turned dangerous when, fueled by pregnancy hormones, she decided to mix rat poison into my meal. She said she wanted me to end up in the hospital, but that she never intended to harm the baby or me physically. Kayla pleaded for a reduced sentence, claiming she never expected me to give her husband my plate, which she argued ultimately poisoned him instead. Of course, the judge didn't take kindly to her actions and Kayla was sentenced to prison. It'll be a long while before she's back in our lives. As for Jamie, he is finally free. He's officially divorced from her. We've seen him a few times over the past few months and have kept him included in family events whenever we can. Jamie reassured me that none of what happened was my fault, and I apologized to him repeatedly for handing him my poisoned plate. That moment has haunted me for so long, and hearing him say it wasn't my fault meant the world. I couldn't help but cry, wishing I had done things differently so he never had to go through that. As for James and me, things are finally looking up. We now have a beautiful baby daughter, and her presence has filled our lives with so much warmth and joy. Nate, our son, is absolutely thrilled about being a big brother, and he has been incredibly loving and protective of his little sister. Seeing them bond has made us appreciate everything even more. My parents and in-laws have been so supportive throughout this entire journey. They've helped us navigate this new phase of our lives, offering wisdom and love every step of the way. Thank you to everyone who has followed our journey. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and click the notification bell so you don't miss any more of these shocking real-life stories.